Hello, my name is Professor Shiladitya Rakshit. Right to Humanitarian Assistance. Introduction. Every natural disaster and armed conflicts affects individuals adversely. Across the globe, millions of people are displaced from their homes and many living in crowded camps due to natural disasters and armed conflicts. The impacts of both man-made and other natural disasters are severe and will lead to displacement, loss of basic necessities, and extreme poverty. The main victims are civilians, often the poorest and the most vulnerable among them, mainly living in developing countries. Thus, the emergencies caused by armed conflict, other human-made crises, and environmental hazards cause immense suffering for those who do not immediately lose their lives. Many will lose loved ones, experience catastrophic damage to their homes and livelihoods, witness destruction of their communities, and suffer the dangers and humiliations of displacement and destitution. For them, the aftermath of a catastrophe becomes a daily struggle for survival, for dignity, and for a future. This situation can be remedied to a large extent if there is an aid or assistance from people or country who is able to extend such assistance. After Second World War, the world community realized the importance to have a framework for providing assistance to needy country and people during natural disasters and armed conflict. This has resulted in the development of a right to humanitarian assistance as a part of a fundamental human right. Learning outcomes. After reading this module, students will be able to understand the concept and meaning of the right to humanitarian assistance, how the right to humanitarian assistance is a human right, how the right to humanitarian assistance is a group right. Right to humanitarian assistance. Concept and meaning. Humanitarian assistance is not defined by any of the major humanitarian or human rights instruments. Generally, the term humanitarian assistance will apply to items essential to survival, such as food, water, medical supplies, clothing, and related non-food items. Example, water containers, cooking utensils, soap, etc., or the means to immediately obtain any such items. Example, cash assistance. It will also apply to essential services such as emergency medical care. Access to humanitarian assistance must also necessarily include not only access to relief goods, but also access to and for the personal and equipment such as vehicle and telecommunications or information technology items needed to carry out humanitarian operations. Thus, humanitarian assistance comprises of providing goods and services essential for the survival of those being directly affected by man-made disasters, including armed conflict or natural disasters. It may comprise material aid and or the service of personnel. The human right to humanitarian assistance could be defined as the human right of the individuals and groups affected by a natural or small disaster and inadequately supplied by the affected states. To receive humanitarian assistance by the international community, the latter should have an obligation to provide assistance on the basis of the consent given una tantum by adhering to treaty recognizing and regulating the right. humanitarian assistance should be carried out in the respect of the agreed modalities and in compliance with the fundamental humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality and impartiality. Such a right may be invoked in peacetime. When natural disasters occur, more significantly, it may also be claimed in the course of armed conflicts, either international or internal. Resolution adopted by the Institute of International Law in 2003 defines humanitarian assistance as all acts, activities, and human and material resources for the provision of goods and services of an exclusively humanitarian character indispensable for the survival and the fulfillment of the essential needs of the victim of disasters. In this definition, the term goods includes foodstuffs, drinking water, medical supplies, and equipment, means of shelter, clothing, bedding, vehicles, and all other goods indispensable for the survival and the fulfillment of the essential needs of the victims of disasters. This term never includes weapons, ammunition, or any other military material. The term services means the means of transport, tracing services, medical services, religious, spiritual, and psychological assistance, reconstruction, demining, decontamination, voluntary return of refugees and IDPs, and all other services indispensable for the survival and the fulfillment of the essential needs of the victim of disasters. Likewise, the term disaster means calamitous events which endanger life, health, physical integrity, or the right not to be subjected to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, other fundamental human rights, or the essential needs of the population, whether of natural origin such as earthquake, volcanic eruptions, windstorm, torrential rains, floods, landslides, thaws, droughts, fires, famine, epidemic, or man-made disasters of technological origin such as chemical disasters or nuclear explosions, are caused by armed conflicts or violence such as international or internal armed conflicts, internal disturbance or violence, terrorist activities. The term victim refers to a group of human beings whose fundamental human rights or whose essential needs are endangered. Right to humanitarian assistance, a human right. Traditionally, at international law, humanitarian assistance was considered as a charitable operation. However, with the adoption of the convention establishing the International Relief Union in 1927, the attitude has changed and the countries started viewing it as a progress for upholding human dignity. The basic purpose of IRU was to collect documents of all kinds of natural disasters and provide organized relief for civilian victims. The right to humanitarian assistance is not expressly recognized by major international human rights instruments. However, this right can trace its root from various provisions in such international instruments. Among the various provisions of human rights instruments which can be taken into account in the context of right to humanitarian assistance, right to life, health, food and shelter, and the special care for children and sick. The Universal Declaration on Human Rights 1948 opens by recognizing the inherent dignity and the inalienable right of all human beings. The Declaration proclaimed itself to be a common standard of achievement for all people and nations. Article 22 of the Declaration states that everyone is entitled to the economic, social, and cultural rights which are indispensable for his dignity and the free. development of the personality. Such rights are to be secured both through national efforts and international cooperation. States set the standards, and by states ensure the rights which are laid down. These general provisions of the Declaration would themselves support important principles relevant to humanitarian assistance, including the principle that one state should assist another in emergency, that states should prepare for disasters with their territory and take measures designed to minimize suffering following a disaster, and that state should accept relief after the occurrence of a disaster if their own resources are inadequate. The most basic of all human rights is the right to life. Article 3 of the UDHR states everyone has a right to life, liberty and security of person. Articles 1 of the ICCPR states more specifically that every human being has the inherent right to life. This right shall be protected by law. Specifically, the Covenant on Civil and Political Right holds no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his life, and it notes that this right may not be suspended even amidst a public emergency that threatens the life of the nation. The right to life imposes an obligation to the states to ensure some minimum standards for the employment or enjoyment. Hence, when the minimum standards of right to life are threatened or lost due to natural or man-made disasters, it is the duty of the state to provide assistance to individuals to the right to life in its real meaning. This obligation of the state supports the claim of individuals' right to humanitarian assistance. Further, the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights expressly guarantees the right to an adequate standard of living, including adequate food, clothing and housing, the right to be free from hunger, and the right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. Moreover, the Covenant requires that a state take steps to realize these rights in the maximum of its available resources. The Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights have stated that the drafters meant this to include not only domestic resources but also international assistance with respect to the right to food. The committee specifically articulated an obligation to accept foreign aid. The right to humanitarian assistance has been expressly recognized as a human right by few human rights instruments: the 4 Geneva Convention of 1949, the 2 additional protocols of 1977, and the same additional protocol of 2005 recognizes the right to humanitarian assistance during armed conflict. Right to humanitarian assistance may be found in Article 22 of the African Charter. On the rights and welfare of the child, it states that parties to the present Charter shall take all appropriate measures to ensure that a child who is seeking refugee status or who is considered a refugee in accordance with applicable international or domestic law shall, whether unaccompanied or accompanied by parents, legal guardians or close relatives, receive appropriate protection and humanitarian assistance in the enjoyment of the right set out in the Charter and other international human rights and humanitarian instruments to which the state are parties. Likewise, Article 11 of the International Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities 2005 also provides that state parties shall take, in accordance with their obligations under international law, including international human rights, humanitarian law and international human rights law all necessary measures to ensure the protection and safety of persons with disabilities in situations of risk, including situations of armed conflict, humanitarian emergencies, and the occurrence of natural disasters. Further, Articles 9, Clause 2b of the African Union Convention for the Protection, Assistance of Internally Displaced Persons, Africa 2009, the Kampala Convention provides that the state parties shall provide internally displaced persons to the fullest extent practicable and with the least possible delay with adequate humanitarian assistance, which shall include food, water, shelter, medical care and other health services, sanitation, education, any other necessary social services, and where appropriate, extend such assistance to local and host communities. It should be remembered here that there is no similar recognition of a human right to humanitarian assistance is spelled out in a universally binding and general treaty. It is to be noted here the right to humanitarian assistance has also been recognized by a number of soft law instruments at international level. Some of the important of them are the resolution of the first International Conference on Humanitarian Law and Moral 1987, the Principles of Humanitarian Assistance, adopted by the San Remo International Institute of Humanitarian Law 1992, the Code of Conduct for International Red Cross and the Red Crescent Movement 1994, the Mohawk Criteria 1995, the Guiding Principles of Internal Displacement 2001, Institute of International Law, Resolution on Humanitarian Assistance 2003. Right to humanitarian assistance, a group right. Right to humanitarian assistance means human right of the individuals and groups affected by a natural or man-made disaster and inadequately supplied by the affected state to receive humanitarian assistance. The international law imposes an obligation to the nations and international community to guarantee and protect the right without any form of discrimination. Generally, an individual is the holder of a human right. However, the holder of right to humanitarian assistance is a group of people. Hence, the right is categorized as a third generation or group rights. Everyone has a right to receive humanitarian assistance necessary to sustain life and dignity in disasters from governmental or other organization. The principles of non-intervention and state sovereignty cannot be a bar to humanitarian assistance. It is generally short-term and focuses on immediate relief and facilitation, the early return to normal lives and livelihoods. The purpose of such assistance is saving lives, alleviating suffering, maintaining human dignity, and supporting sustainable recovery from emergencies. Criticism. The recognition of right to humanitarian assistance is a human right or group right has been criticized by various authors. One of the serious criticism is that the only intervention providing humanitarian assistance at the time of an armed conflict is a violation of state sovereignty, and hence the international community should not interfere. This follows from the principles of sovereignty, which can be traced back to the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, where it was convened that the ruler of a state will also determine the country's religion. A principle whose extension effectively had the consequences of excluding any outside interference in the relations with the principal and the prince and its subjects. This principle was subsequently reaffirmed and further elaborated in the treaties of the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 to embrace not only religious but also political matters in the 20th century. The principle of sovereignty was expressly incorporated in Article 2.1 of the Charter of the United Nations. The criticism lacks its force due to the fact that the Acts 2.7 and 25, together with Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, the member states of the UN agreed to subject the sovereignty to the Security Council in matters that threaten international peace and security. Thus, international community can intervene in a state internal affairs, and such interferences should be considered as a violation of state sovereignty. This was expressly stated by International Court of Justice in the case of Nicaragua versus United States, wherein the court held that giving humanitarian aid is not an unlawful intervention, and there can be no doubt that the provision of strictly humanitarian aid to persons or forces in another country, whatever their political affiliations or objectives, cannot be regarded as unlawful intervention or in any other way contrary to international law. The right to give assistance includes a continuum of action of varying degrees of intrusion, with military intervention at one extreme and mere condemnation at the other. If humanitarian assistance takes the form of military intervention, the use of force is required to be necessary and proportional. However possible, abuses of the right to give humanitarian assistance remains a concern. Another major criticism is that the right to humanitarian assistance is a concept that developed states forged to legitimize their intervention towards poor countries. However, this criticism is not of any force due to the fact that a number of developed countries supported the United States resolutions, United Nations resolutions on the right to humanitarian intervention. The interventions in Bosnia and Somalia, for instance, were requested by many Muslim nations and African states. It is not reasonable to think that they are simply agents of the great powers with permanent seats in the Security Council. Another criticism is that intervention occurs only in situations in which the US, France, and Great Britain have interest. The recent interventions in the form of humanitarian assistance prove the criticism is wrong. Summary. After reading this module, we understood the right to humanitarian assistance, the concept and meaning of the right of humanitarian assistance, and humanitarian assistance as a group and as a human right. Thank you.